Just saying. So we talked about neoclassicism on Monday. And what happens in the 19th century, we're going to see things happen very quickly, and the spectrum of styles will just explode. And part of that has everything to do with a notion that I had been talking about for a while now, and that is the artists are more in control of the narrative. They are writing their own narrative, so to speak. They are telling their own stories. They're not particularly under the thumb of the aristocracy or the papacy. And so a lot of things start to happen. And we saw that with the French Revolution, and a whole style kind of reemerged, neoclassicism, as a counter to all of the Rococo, which was seen as decadent, frivolous, not serious, and it became kind of a symbol of all that was wrong with the aristocracy and the wealth gap and all of that stuff. So I want to kind of stick on this point just a little bit. And that is that this is something that's going on in art. We saw that in France. We see the American Revolution, and they build their capital city in Washington, D.C., and it's dominated by neoclassical architecture. And as I said, the founding fathers of this new republic were basically educated in the classics. So this was not anything new to them. And in fact, they were putting their education to good use in terms of trying to decide how to set up this new government and so on. And so there's this idea there, democracy. And we see it in France, we see it in America. And this idea that starts to germinate that regular people are important, this idea gains a lot of traction through the 19th century. And in fact, we start to see a focus on ordinary people, empowering ordinary people in a way that just hadn't really happened before in Western history. And so that's that democratic idea. And I just wanted to bring that up because I want you to keep that in mind as we look at some of this artwork. And so, so we have neoclassicism, and we have romanticism, and we have romantic artists, and it's really about the counter, as I was saying, to all of this. This is basically linear. It uses cool colors, even though this is an exotic subject. It's still kind of well organized. It's done as perhaps the Greeks and Romans would have painted this subject. But we have here John Henry Fuseli, The Nightmare. So all of this stuff about the rational and the orderly, the Oath of the Horatii, a call to reason over emotion. And you saw in that David painting, which I say amplifies. It's a very great example of neoclassical painting because the men are rational, they are brave. The women are emotional and they're kind of off to the side. Well, let's not dismiss the emotional or the things we don't understand quite so easily. And that's really where the romantic movement takes shape. And so this is the nightmare, and you see this woman, very theatrical. You see this. I can zoom in because this is not a PDF today. The nightmare, the demons that are appearing in her sleep. It is the result of dreams. And you see here is a horse that's actually kind of freaked out by the whole thing too. The nightmare. Nightmares are extremely emotional, wouldn't you think? In terms of comparing that to the logic and the order and all of this stuff that goes along with the Age of Enlightenment. There's this part of us. And so there are a lot of writers, there are a lot of scholars, there's a lot of artists starting to explore this idea. William Blake, Ancient of Days. And this is actually an etching colored with basically like colored pencils. So this is a print and it's colored, but look at this. There's a lot of people over the years that have taken this class of this period really seem to like this work a lot. Europe, a prophecy. Now, a prophecy in itself is not a logical or rational idea either. But at any rate, Blake does this thing with this godlike figure from the sky, and this bringing knowledge down to the earth. This is the prophecy. The prophecy comes from the heavens, from God, if you will. And so Ancient of Days and these concerns go back to antiquity too, much like neoclassicism, but kind of different too. This is kind of the other side. And there had been people talk about this period of time in terms of Greek mythology. How many of you heard of Apollo and Dionysus? Sophie knows. Two Greek gods, they were brothers, and one, Apollo, was very rational. And he is really somebody that kind of appears in a big way during the Renaissance time. The great Michelangelo statue of David has been compared to ancient depictions of Apollo. And this David that Michelangelo created, you guys, I'm sure remember this. It was not particularly, it was extremely rational. And it was the idea at the time, and people have researched this extensively, that Michelangelo David was really the triumph of the rational, of the thinking of the knowledge, he basically, David, outsmarted Goliath. And that's really what that is about. And you see that Michelangelo statue, and he's very confident, very thoughtful, has this perfect physique, unlike the other Davids that we saw that were kind of like young men and so on. And so anyway, this Apollonian versus Dionysian culture. Dionysian was the brother of Apollo, and he was very irrational. And they always have it from ancient times associated Dionysus with the emotional. And he was the one that did a lot of irrational things, and he was all about pleasure and Dionysian excesses, drinking, overeating, all of this stuff. It's about pleasure, not rational. And so anyway, that's kind of what happens here. And as I say, a lot of scholars have really have driven this point home. So, talking about this, Fuseli the Nightmare, there emerges a great romantic artist out of Spain, Francisco Goya. You might have heard of him. There have been many books written about Goya. The sleep of reason produces monsters. So I've been talking about reason, pleasure, rational, emotional. The sleep of reason produces monsters, and this is, in its own way, Goya kind of splitting it down the middle. And so we can be rational, we can be reasonable, we can be smart and scientific and all of that, but we are still human. And when we put all of that rationality away, we are haunted by our demons, our fears, our inner selves. And I got to say this too. All of this was done at a time before psychology. Way before Freud talked about the id and the ego and the superego. And the superego was really pretty much the rational, and the id was pretty much the romantic. And the ego being that person in the middle, the sense of self. And this is what Goya was doing to kind of tease this out. And so anyway, I tell you a little bit about Goya because he's a really fascinating character. He was the court painter for the family for King Charles IV in Spain. And so here he is, Goya, the court painter, doing his obligatory portrait of the royal family. And a lot of scholars have taken this all apart too, because there is something quite different about this portrait, and it's kind of like Las Meninas by Velázquez, which was 100 years prior to this. But we got the king, and he's got all of the medals on his chest and things, but he doesn't look particularly royal. And the queen, she's kind of sitting back and she's kind of looking judgmentally back at the viewer. So anyway, did I have? I thought I had Khan Academy video for that. Maybe I didn't. But at any rate, suffice it to say that what happens with Goya is that he becomes like one of the early and one of the greatest romantic painters of the time. And oh my goodness, I'm going way back. There we go. Sorry about the distraction. Got to navigate this thing by hand. Bottom line, though, this is kind of almost a satirical portrait of the king, not sitting on his royal throne, being compare this to David's coronation of Napoleon. This is like so radically different. And so anyway, this is kind of part of the Spanish court painters being 2 steps ahead of the royal family, just like Velázquez, Goya the same way. And in fact, this has famously been referred to as that Francisco Goya looks more like a grocer than he does a king. And really, you know, just kind of staring off into space, not particularly regal. All of the other people, hey, brother, zoom in on this. Look at her. That's a crazy aunt that you keep locked up in the basement. You know what I mean? Just saying, I mean, all of these, this whole family, it's in the vein of what we saw with Hogarth and that satire that he brought to his artwork. But here it is, 15 or so years later, Goya becoming a very serious romantic artist. Neoclassicism, an appeal to the logic, to the rational, to the order. This painted to stir up emotion. This is exactly what neoclassicism, neoclassic artists would have denounced as being irresponsible. They're stirring up emotions. This is like, look at the blood. Look at this young man, very defiant. I'll tell you a story behind this. What happens here, and this is kind of a European thing in the 16, 17, 1800s, even resulting in 2 world wars in the 1900s. European countries, they almost always seem to stay at war with each other. And in this case, these are French troops. This is Napoleon's army, and they had occupied this Spanish town, and a sniper's bullet kills a French soldier. And so this is the same kind of story you've seen probably in war movies and things. The French commander said, I want the person who shot my soldier. Nobody steps forward. So what do? They start taking hostages, and they say, until the perpetrator comes forward, I'm going to keep executing these people until I find out who did this. And that's really what's happening. That's why you see the pile of bodies here, all of the blood all over the place. And then you see this young man defiantly throwing up his hands and saying, go ahead, kill me. You can see all of the people can't even watch. I mean, this is like a horrible scene. And to me, this is just me, my own interpretation of this, but look at those French soldiers, the firing squad, if you will. To me, this is like a model for a lot of portrayals of drone-like or robotic sort of soldiers. How about Darth Vader's army in Star Wars? They all look the same. They have no personality. They do as they're told. They're mostly robots. That's kind of how these guys are portrayed. There's no personality. You don't see anything. They're all dressed alike. They're all pointed the same way. And so anyway, a lot of villains in filmdom have been portrayed in this kind of way. Nameless, faceless, do as you're told, killing machines. And so anyway, that's the 3rd of May, 1808. And Saturn devouring one of his children just a few years later. So what we got here, this is in some way we talk about Saturn, Roman god, eating his children, which is really kind of, it's its own moral statement. And eating your young has been an idea, a saying, a metaphor that has lasted through the ages. And the idea of eating your young. Is there any comparison to the world today that you could say they're eating their young? Yeah, maybe. I've heard that being said a lot about climate change and about how people of my generation destroying the planet and leaving nothing habitable for the young people. That's the idea of eating your young. Just don't care about future generations. And by the way, I don't believe that. I have a Chevy Volt. I drive an electric car. I have solar panels on my house, so hey, don't look at me. But that's Goya and these horrible, emotional. You could say, you could make that statement without showing a baby with this monstrous Saturn chewing off the arms. You know, this is romanticism, an appeal to the emotions. Well, not that many people quite go out that far, but a few do. Here we're going back to France. Theodore Jericho, Insane Woman. One of the things that the romantics were really interested in was insanity. And we'll go back here. The sleep of reason produces monsters. Sleep, monsters, nightmares, insanity. And again, I have to go back and say, this is before modern psychology, before anybody really understood how the brain works. But a lot of people at the time, and this will persist for about 100 years until after Freud. But there was an idea that people who were insane by choice. People that refuse to deal with reality as everyone else knows it and decided to live in their own reality. And this one, it's called Insane Woman, and there used to be, in parentheses, envy as a subtitle to this, because Jericho kind of looked at a lot of people who were declared to be insane, but try to capture that what was going on inside their minds. And so that insanity That's the other extreme from logic, scientific method, orderly classicism. And so Jericho and would kind of compare this to David, Napoleon crossing the Saint Bernard Pass, charging chasseur, which means a horseback soldier. And here he is. And this, in a lot of ways, is a lot different. We see Napoleon being victorious, being very confident, being very powerful. This guy, on the other hand, he's got to watch his own back. He's actually fighting for his life. And so all of that heroism kind of out the window. This is war, and war is kind of an ugly thing. And again, that's always been a subject of these artists, because as I was saying, for hundreds of years, it seemed that European people were fighting against each other a lot. And this, the Raft of the Medusa. And if you had a keen eye and a photographic memory, when I showed you that David film from Khan Academy, they showed that room in the Louvre. This is right next to the David Oath of Horatii, Jericho's Raft of the Medusa. And you can see it was done 25, 30 years afterwards, but this is romanticism. And it was there to stir the emotions, to get people angry. It was very insightful. I mean, insightful in trying to incite anger and rage, not insightful like, oh, I'd never guess that. Story of this painting. The Medusa was a tragedy. It was a shipwreck. The Medusa was a pleasure cruise ship back in the day, 200 years ago. So, you know, like Carnival cruises or something, you know, it's what people been doing that for hundreds of years. What happened on the Medusa was that it collapsed. And these people were left out to sea and didn't have the technology we have today. These people were lost. And they basically found a piece of the ship, made a raft out of it, and had to wait for someone to come by and rescue. And there are versions of this painting that'll show a ship on the background coming to rescue these people. But this is a tragedy. This is a tragedy that should not have happened. And basically, just like today, did you hear about that terrible train wreck in Greece today? 2 passenger trains going full speed run headlong into each other. Dozens of people are dead. This is a really terrible train wreck. You'll hear about it. Watch the news, read the paper or something. But that just happened within the last 24 hours. And already multiple people, some have been arrested and others fired as they are trying to figure out who was responsible for this tragedy. Well, same thing happened here. Everybody looked at this as a failure of the government, the people who were supposed to oversee this industry, to make sure that ships are seaworthy, to make sure that, you know, everybody would be safe. The rescue people were late getting there. And in fact, the way this is all done, there's my zoom in. See, yeah, they're all mostly don't have any clothes left. They got this body hanging off the edge, head underwater, obviously. Obviously dead. When these people were finally rescued, the press was all over. They wanted to find out what the heck happened. You know, this is the Medusa. This was like, anyway, these people reported that they had stayed out at sea for way too long and that they had to resort to cannibalism to stay alive. And this was like shocked the nation. And so that's what he painted, the raft of the Medusa. And you can see 16 feet high, 23 feet wide. Again, this is like IMAX. Early 19th century IMAX. It's like huge, like the Oath of the Horatii, there to make an impact. But at any rate, this is an appeal to the emotions. It was there to stir outrage. It was what the Romantics were doing. There's another Delacroix, the death of Sardanapalus. And I found out something about this painting just in the last year. Sardanapalus was a Greek name for an Assyrian king who went by the name of Ashurbanipal. Didn't know that. Anyway, but the story is the same. What happens is that this king, Sardanapalus, he's there in his fortress city being invaded. The enemy is at the gates. The enemy is inside the compound. Sardanapalus, he's there, and he wants to make sure that those invaders don't get everything that they came in here to loot, including, in this case, the women, his harem. We've been talking about this harem idea, the odalisque and stuff like that. Yeah, these are dead women. This woman's actually being executed right here. Didn't want the invading armies to have the women, and they're gonna kill the horse and all kinds of stuff. This is like so crazy. You can see this guy pulling in the horse so that they can execute the horse. There's the knife. I'm gonna kill this woman. Please, I beg you, sire, have mercy on me. Doesn't matter. He's just kind of quietly, calmly overseeing this whole thing, and he will commit suicide. But this is an appeal to the emotions. This is something to actually stoke outrage. Delacroix, scenes from the massacre at Chios. As I was saying, war was kind of a constant thing. And here they are. This is the Turks and, oh, maybe the French. Anyway, here we go, same thing. Dead people all around. They're from the battle here. They are the survivors, but check it out. Here's the officer, and these people are standing guard, and these are probably prisoners, and this woman is dead. Her baby is looking, there was blood, gore. Scenes from the massacre at Chios. So what we see here in a lot of ways is a lot of anti-war, just all of this stuff. So Delacroix, and this, liberty leading the people. Again, stirring the emotions, but this is about, the subject is about the French Revolution. And there's liberty holding the tricolor, French flag, and all of these people are rising up in support of liberty. And you can see they have all different kinds of things, a musket, a sword. This young guy has a couple of pistols. Got a lot of French soldiers lying dead, loyalists to the king. Liberty leading the people. This is not quite as epic as the raft of the Medusa, but it's still like 8.5 feet tall, 10, almost 12, 11 feet wide. The tiger hunt, as I was saying earlier, neoclassicism, romantic artists alike, they were really very keen to bring back images of Napoleon's conquest. And so all of these places in Greece and Turkey and the Middle East, and all of this stuff about the odalisques, the harems and all this stuff, it's all like exotic stuff, and it was all new to the French public. And so there was a keen interest in how the rest of the world lived. And basically the French before this time were basically unexposed to what was going on in other parts of the world. And this is the tiger hunt. And it is, in a lot of ways, I think this is like high drama, if you will. Tiger's got that horse's leg, gonna bite it right off. You got the other guys hunting assistants, you know, that's how they do these Europeans, but this is a case of a Middle Easterner, probably. But at any rate, that's how they did hunts. Back in the day, you would go on a safari, and a safari meant that you had all of these other hunting assistants, people who could track down big game. They would know how to go about killing the big game and stuff. And so, yeah, you have these guides, you have these assistants, and this guy trying to help save the hunter in this case. And he's trying to save himself with a spear, but high drama, lots of blood, red color, I mean, just, and the women of Algiers in their apartment. And again, exotic subject matter, predominantly warm colors, the idea that warm colors excite the emotions, bottom line, is what you got. And so we still have some of this stuff that is neoclassicism going on. And here's neoclassical architecture, Arc de Triomphe. Bottom line, this is neoclassicism. It's based right on a Roman triumphal arch. But back to the Romantic. Caspar David Friedrich, Abbey in the Oak Forest. Aside from all of the war and the insanity and that kind of thing, romantic artists really started turning their attention to the forces of nature, to what you would call the sublime, that is not easily explainable or understood. And so what we have here is this abbey in the oak forest, and the abbey itself is just this one remaining wall. And the trees are dead. It's winter time. Got this haunting sky. Caspar David Friedrich, wanderer above a sea of mist. The forces of nature, the spiritual experience of witnessing the forces of nature. And that is what Caspar David Friedrich was all about. He's bringing in yet another dimension. And I'm talking about comparison, romantic versus neoclassicism, romantic explaining the forces of nature and explaining spirituality. Spirituality has kind of an uneasy place in all of this rational dialogue. John Constable, the Hayway, not so much about a spiritual experience, but living in peace and harmony with nature. And Constable will go out to the countryside and make these themes of life in harmony with nature. And he was so much interested in nature, and he was such an accurate painter. Actually, these cloud patterns are very exact. And people that study climate look at these and try to figure out exactly what the climate was like 200 years ago. But Joseph Mallard William Turner, usually referred to as JMW Turner, the slave ship. Whoa, we're bringing in another thing that should incite emotions in the viewer. And what this is all about, this is slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. And there are a lot of accounts of this happening. No weather predictions, no satellite imagery. When sailors of this era and the centuries even after this and much before this, going out to sea was always pretty dicey. It wasn't an exact science. They knew when we had hurricane seasons. But think about it. In this day and age, we still have people in the Caribbean looking for shipwrecks. Why were there so many shipwrecks? Because they didn't know, they were at the mercy of those forces of nature. And in this case, this slave ship is doing just that. And what they're doing is throwing over the slaves to save themselves. So this should actually stir up emotions, much like the raft of the Medusa. Maybe even worse. This is because slavery itself is evil, and you got see those hands, they're drowning out here. And you see this too. This is an interesting part. Chains, the hardware of slavery, if you will. God and the angel picking up some of the souls. There's the ship. At the forces of nature. And so this is an anti-slavery painting, to be sure, and it's about those sublime forces of nature that are still mysterious, unpredictable, and sublime. And they have a way of putting humans in their place by comparison, because even the most powerful armies and navies will succumb to those forces of nature. And so anyway, Thomas Cole, the Oxbow, what we have here is that a lot of American painters start picking up on some of those same romantic ideas and talking about the awesomeness of nature. And this is really kind of an interesting painting here too, because you see Cole has set up his umbrella and his art supplies. He's down here. He's trying to find a good place from which to make his painting. But these guys were interested in nature too. And there is a parallel here, because in literature, you're starting to see a lot of literature arise in that romantic tradition with that kind of sensibility about nature. And I think probably the most famous American was Henry David Thoreau on Baldwin Pond. The idea of a person getting out away from the city, living in harmony with nature. You could talk about Constable that way. You could talk about Thomas Cole this way too. You could see the connections in their attitudes towards nature. And these guys, Thomas Cole, they were called the Hudson River painters. And what they would do is go into upstate New York, and in this case, it's actually in Massachusetts. But bottom line is that they went away from the big cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, and went into what was basically the sparsely populated frontier. And so they did this. They painted nature. And as a side note, I showed you Cole down here and his stuff here. Mostly what they did in the Hudson River School was that they went out and they drew sketches and did quick small paintings of these landscapes. And again, the forces of nature, this storm coming in, it looks pretty menacing. Or in this case, after a thunderstorm going that way. But bottom line, they would make small artworks and they'd take them back to their studios in the big city, mostly New York City, and then paint them in these gaslight sunlit studios. So you can see here, this is like 4 something feet high, 6 feet wide. Well, you know, good luck with that, trying to paint that from this cliff, trying to haul that thing through the woods. So anyway, that's how they did it. But you see, after the thunderstorm, and you see the trees have been knocked down and stuff. And Albert Bierstadt, I talk about paintings you guys like, a number of you talked about this. And you see, this is 1868, this is 1836, so there's a 32-year difference. But Bierstadt comes from that school, but he goes out west. This is from California, and many of Bierstadt's paintings are of California. And California is naturally beautiful, a lot of great, you know, Yosemite and a lot of other places, Sierra Nevada mountains and so on. And he went out there and was kind of doing the same thing, these gigantic, epic landscapes. But there's a difference, a fundamental difference, and if you research Bierstadt, you'll see this, because this is part of the research, part of the discussion on Bierstadt in this day and age, and that is he was actually making these idyllic portraits, these idyllic landscapes to entice people to move out to the West. The West was the whole, everything pretty much west of St. Louis, for example, at that time was sparsely populated and was mostly populated with native people. And there was this idea that circulated in Washington, in the eastern states, post-Civil War, called Manifest Destiny. The idea that this country, the United States, should be connected, ocean to ocean. Everything in the middle belongs to the United States. Well, you know, this is 1868. Custer's Last Stand, 1876. But that was part of that tension. That was part of the wars that were being fought in the American West. And there was a guy named, I just had his name. Anyway, famously said, a guy, a very influential newspaper man, Horace Greeley, go west, young man. And that was a call to populate all of this land that had been basically the Native American lands between the coast. And so anyway, why am I saying this? Because by this time we have the Transcontinental Railroad. We can move people out there. They're going out there in so-called wagon trains. They're going out there by rail, stagecoach, all of this stuff that you see in the films. Well, that was this period of time. And Bierstadt has been looked at, as I say, this is new scholarship, but there's a lot of truth to this. And he was making these idyllic portraits of the American West to entice those very same people to move out into the Western United States. Because most of the places in between Kansas and California, they were not even states yet. Colorado became a state in 1876, but you know, Oklahoma, in the 20th century, 1898, somewhere in there. Arizona, New Mexico, not states until 1912. So anyway, these are postcards trying to lure people to go out and live in just beautiful place. They didn't tell us anything about the Donner Party or stuff like that. You know about the Donner Party, by the way? Bunch of pioneers, as we call them, wagon train, Oregon Trail, got stuck in the Sierra Nevada mountains, snowstorm, stuck. Like the Raft of the Medusa, this was like a big thing. It was a big scandal. They had to resort to cannibalism and things to make it through the winter. And when that became known, it was really quite a big deal. Donner Party, wanted no more. But at any rate, Frederick Edwin Church, Twilight in the Wilderness, 1860s. Again, go west. And so that is American Romanticism. And so that in turn spawns another movement, and one that's actually goes back to some of that concern about everyday people doing everyday things. This is Gustave Courbet, the Stonebreakers, 1849. We're back in France. And we're kind of getting more concerned with everyday people. We're not talking about ideology or go west or rational versus emotional. This comes up as really kind of out of some of those paintings that the Dutch did of everyday people and doing everyday things. And it was they were looking at this all over again. And there was literature that corresponds to this advocacy and interest in ordinary people. What you have here are actually some philosophers starting to germinate some of their great works. People like Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto. That's all about everyday people and a concern for everyday people. It's been kind of abused and used and so on, but at any rate, we start to see the union movement, labor unions start to get involved. You know, a lot of things. It was starting to look at everyday people. Stonebreakers. This is how some people made their living 175 years ago. You know what they're doing? They're actually, you see, he's got a hammer making stone. This guy here, we're taking, this is how you got gravel back in the day. Had some guy out there busting up large stones, making little stones and carrying them away. I don't know if you guys ever see this, and you can find old films on YouTube and stuff, but one of the things that you'll see a lot of in those old films are people working or people who are imprisoned. And a lot of them, you see them out there on the road crews, you know, in the chain gangs, but you'll also see this reference to breaking stones. And that would, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, that's really what you did. If you were sentenced to hard labor, that's what you did. You made gravel. You take rocks, big rocks, and make little rocks out of them, and the chain gangs would use that gravel to make the roads. That's how things were done 100 years ago. But at any rate, that's what they're doing. It's kind of a tough way to make a living. And you can see they're pretty shabby. Clothes are all torn up all over. I mean, and so, yeah, they're out there in the hot sun making gravel. Stonebreakers. Want to point this out too. Dresden destroyed in 1945. I know what that happened. 1945. I've been saying, Sophie knows. What happened? As I was saying, the Europeans seem to be constantly at war, one people, one country with another, not always the same. But this is a World War II. And this is towards the end of World War II. And there was this town in Germany, Dresden, and it remained pretty much untouched by the war. Didn't have any strategic value. Just there. remained untouched. And it was this place of great architecture and art. They had a lot of paintings, a lot of sculptures, a lot of grand architecture, opera house, all this stuff. And so, as the story goes, Winston Churchill, in retaliation for the bombings of London in 1940, decided that before this war is over, I'm going to destroy one of their cities, and took this Dresden and sent a bunch of bombers, I should say, with what they call fire bombs, incendiary bombs, they have white phosphorus in it. Basically leveled this town and all night long air raid. And this was one of the famous paintings that was in there. Destroyed 1945. So anyway, but we still have images of it, and it still tells that story about a concern about ordinary people doing ordinary things. And there's really a lot of people talking about that. This is another Courbet from around the same time. This is an epic painting too. You see 10 feet high, 21 feet long. And I've been talking a lot about these paintings. I'll let somebody else do the talking here. Yeah, I want to make sure I got my share screen right. Yeah, we're good. And you can hear it. We're all good.
Musée d'Orsay in Paris, looking at Gustave Courbet's The Burial at Ornans, which was his beginning, his manifesto. This was a painting that expressed what he thought painting should be.
Large paintings were supposed to be historical, heroic,
Allegorical, religious, but this is a genre painting. This is a painting of everyday life. And according to the rules of the Academy, it had no business being on a canvas this large.
Right, genre paintings were small, history paintings were big. That was the rule. But here we have an ordinary funeral, a group of ordinary figures in an ordinary place.
But what I love is that when Courbet submitted this painting to the jury, he submitted it as a history painting, and he must have considered it to be a history painting of our world now.
The subject matter promoted by the Academy asks artists to tirelessly repeat the same subjects from ancient Greek and Roman history, and politics and religious subjects. And Courbet wanted to paint his own day, his own time. In fact, he said, an epic can only be reproduced by its own artists. I hold the artists of one century basically incapable of reproducing an aspect of a past or a future century.
So Courbet is painting his world, the world that he grew up in. In fact, these are each individual portraits.
Many of them members of Courbet's own family. This is the funeral of Courbet's great uncle. So to submit a painting to the jury of the salon, the jury that decided which paintings could be hung in the official exhibitions called salons, and not even say the name of the person who's being buried, Courbet is definitely making a statement here. So what is he?
It's bringing the experience of rural life into the capital of France and trying to bring it into the most elite environment for the arts. In fact, heroicizing the ordinary, heroicizing common humanity. Look what Courbet has put in the middle of this composition. The grave, but also the grave digger. Courbet gives this simple rebirth, a kind of dignity that is completely unexpected in mid-19th century painting.
The Revolution of 1848 ended the monarchy and ushered in the Second Republic. And it is during this period of realism that we see artists turning to figures of laborers, of workers, and showing them in a noble and heroic manner.
Was the painting, so that all the figures are pushed up to the foreground.
Although there is a bit of meandering back and forth.
That's because in the center foreground is a grave
That opens into our space.
Courbet has created a hard horizontal frieze, in contrast to a vertically oriented canvas that you might expect in a Renaissance painting, where a figure would be assumed into heaven, where we would see angels, where we would see the clouds parting, where we would see the possibility for redemption.
The divine is represented by a crucifix, which is carried by one of the clergymen. So the only sense of the divine is actually physical.
The painting is divided roughly into three groups. At the left is the clergy. In fact, we can see the pallbearers carrying the coffin in from the left. In front of the coffin, we can see the priest. And towards the center, county officials, and to their right, women mourning.
And each of these different types of figures were treated equally. One art historian has called this democracy in painting.
The faces of the figures and their poses have not been idealized. But one of my favorite aspects of this painting is the hunting dog. In a traditionally composed painting, perhaps one for the salon, one would not allow the dog to be represented unless it functions symbolically. This hunting dog seems as if it's just wandered by. And in a sense, Courbet is using it as an emblem of the authenticity of the experience, that a dog might in fact wander by. Some of the figures here are truly mourning, but others look distracted.
And I think it's a lack of a focal point. There's no one place where our eye is drawn. It does give us that sense of the normal distractions of life, even at a funeral, even at an event that marks the death of a beloved family member. There's the realities of everyday life that intrude.
That's probably most clearly represented by the child at the extreme right edge of the canvas, who seems completely involved in her own thoughts, suggesting a kind of interior experience that is central to Courbet's belief.
And I think that speaks to another radical aspect of this painting, which is a lack of interaction between the figures. In an academic painting destined for the salon, following the rules of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, figures interact. They have gestures that are readable, that tell us a story. But here you're right, each figure is very much alone with their thoughts. None of the gestures are helping to guide our attention or to tell us a story.
There are references to the history of painting. We can just make out a skull, a reference perhaps to the skull at the base of the cross in representations of the crucifixion. But the skull looks discarded. The crucifixion is a representation, it's a sculpture. We are firmly planted in the modern world.
Courbet, I think, said this best. He said, painting is essentially a concrete art and can only consist of the representation of real and existing things. It is a completely physical language, the words of which consist of all visible objects. An object which is abstract, not visible, non-existent, is not within the realm of painting.
Instead, show me an angel and I'll paint it.
So it's about time. I just wanted to kind of point out this one notion. I've been saying that the artists have been writing their own narrative. That statement at the end of this to say that artists are the only ones of their own time to be able to represent their time, and that things that are abstract, things from the past, you can't really do that. As he said, show me an angel and I'll paint one. And so that's his narrative. And that's really what's kind of happening with all of these people. The romantic narrative of the sublime forces of nature, the glorification of the everyday people, which is what we see with Courbet, fascination with getting people, bless you, getting people have their emotions stirred by catastrophic events such as wars, or in the raft of Medusa, unavoidable tragedy, and so on. So anyway, these are all narratives that artists themselves are taking up, which is a complete break from what had been happening. So with that, I was gonna talk to you guys today about quiz 3, but there's still 2 of them I don't have, and the site will stay open until tonight. I gotta tell you, Kandinsky is leading the pack of people that named him 4 times, improvisation. But at any rate, we'll talk about that when we come back. We'll talk about those papers that'll be due 1 week from today. We'll try to get everything buttoned up so we can go on break. And so that's all I have. Thank you so much. We'll see you later. You bet.